Good morning, scholars. Today we are going to work on Unit 11, the Civil War, and we are focusing on chapters 21 and 22. So we're getting really close to the end of the unit. Make sure that you're following along with the lessons in your packet, and we are using that study guide to help us study for the assessment. A couple of reminders before we begin. Remember to complete any active assessments on Edulastic. Don't forget to complete iReady Math and Reading. Also complete Math and ELA assessments or assignments and their videos. Remember, our videos really do help to cut down the workload in your packet. So make sure that you're viewing our videos. You might discover some information that might help you complete the work in your packet. All right, so our agenda today, I'm going to state the objective, our big question. I will read chapter 21 to you. You're going to read chapter 22 on your own, and I'm going to discuss the independent work, my expectations, and then we're going to say our goodbye. Our objectives today is I can describe the devastation in the South after the Civil War, and I can explain the purpose of black codes passed in the southern states. So our big question for chapter 21 is, what was life like in the South after the Civil War? Chapter 21, the Southern Ruins. A broad streak of ruin. At the end of the Civil War, the South was a devastated land. Travelers to the region were shocked by what they saw. Wherever General Sherman's army had marched in Georgia and South Carolina, wrote one traveler, the countryside looked for many miles like a broad black streak of ruin. In other words, so much had been burned down. In Tennessee, one visitor stated, the trail of war is visible in burnt up cotton, gin houses, ruined bridges, mills, and factories. And in Virginia, wrote yet another, the barns are all burned, chimneys standing without houses, and houses standing without roofs or doors or windows. Fields that once produced the finest harvest of cotton, tobacco, and grain were covered with weeds. Small farms were destroyed. Nearly half of the South's farm animals were gone. Railroad tracks were torn up. Whatever factories the South had before the war were now mostly destroyed. And many Southerners, both white and African American, were without food, clothing, or any way to make a living. The human losses were even worse. Close to 1/3 of the men and boys who put on the gray uniform of the Confederacy had died during the war. Even more were wounded, some so badly they would never be the same again. In 1866, the year after the war ended, the state of Mississippi spent 1 out of every 5 tax dollars it collected to buy artificial arms and legs for its veterans. As for former slaves, the war brought them freedom. In the first months after the war, a good many African Americans left their old plantations just so they could experience their newfound freedom. They wanted to know what it was like to go wherever they wanted without having to get permission from an owner. One former slave told her former owner that she could not stay and continue to cook for her. If I stay here, she said, I'll never know I am free. Many freed slaves had an even more important reason for taking the road. They hoped to find family members who had been sold or separated from them. But most of the former slaves stayed right where they were. This may seem surprising, but they had to make a living. The best chance of doing that was to get hired to work on the land of their former owner, or to rent some of their lands to farm for themselves. Even though they were now free and could keep the fruits of their labors, their lives didn't improve much. Even while the war was going on, Congress realized it would have to get people back on their feet. Just a month before the war's end, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen were the former slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, clothing, fuel, and medical supplies to needy Southern whites as well as former slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau had its greatest success in education. It set up more than 4,000 schools where former slaves could learn to read and write. Northern churches sent thousands of dedicated women and men to teach in these schools. Before the Civil War, slaves were usually forbidden to learn those skills. Now African American Southerners flocked to these schools, not just children, but adults too. Many of the adults were deeply religious people who had long wanted to read the Bible for themselves. One thing the Freedmen's Bureau did not do, however, was to gain the former slaves their own land. That was a shame, because with their own land, African Americans would have had a chance to support themselves and to become truly independent. As one former slave said, "All I want is to get to own 4 or 5 acres of land that I can build me a little house on and call my home." Another said, "Give us our land and we'll take care of ourselves. But without land, the old masters can hire us or starve us as they please." For a time, African Americans were excited by a rumor that the government would give them 40 acres and a mule to get their new life started. However, it was only a rumor. The only way to give land to the former slaves was to take it away from someone else, such as a former slave owner. A few people in Congress were willing to do that, but most were not, so it did not happen. Sharecropping. Many of the freed slaves continued to farm the lands of their former masters. However, a big problem had to be worked out first. When the Confederacy collapsed, all of its money immediately became worthless. Southern banks also went out of business. Few Southerners had U.S. money. Owners of the land had no money to pay wages to their workers, and the freedmen who wanted to rent the land had no money to pay for it. The problem was solved by developing a system called sharecropping. Sharecropping worked this way. The owners let the freedmen use some of their land, gave them seed, and lent them plows, tools, and mules to work with them. In return, the freedmen gave the owners a share of the crops they raised. Usually they split the crops in half. The sharecropping system was used all through the South. 9 out of 10 former slave families became sharecroppers, and many poor white families did too. So that is the end of chapter 21. Your next chapter is going to go over the Reconstruction and just unifying the United States again after so long of war. So chapter 22, your big question is, how did Andrew Johnson's ideas of Reconstruction differ from the radical Republicans? Our independent work today is the activity page called Who Am I? So in the left column are some people that you have read about in the Civil War unit. In the right column are statements that the individuals actually made or might have made. You're going to match each person with a statement by writing the correct letter on the line. This is kind of like the fun warm-up we did earlier in the week. All right, a couple more reminders before we leave today is don't forget to complete any active assessments on Edulastic. Do not forget about your iReady math and reading minutes. We still need to complete those. And also don't forget to complete math and ELA assignments and reach out to teachers as needed. And don't forget to send your work to your teachers when it says to text a PEC. All right, scholars, have an awesome day. Be good.